After a lot of cutting, sanding, and second guessing, I ended up with the outline of a blank and the drawing of a plate to mount the foil tracks. For a traditional construction, there is no preset order of operation. You can glass top or bottom first. Some tracks like to be below the lamination, some can be at the last step. But for this one, I had to be more careful. Both the top and bottom panels will have the inside lamination done first, outside of the board. Then it will be bounded in the grooves in the EPS, and finally, the outside lamination will encapsulate everything. Because there's no EPS supporting the deck, the stringers linking the box to the deck are even more important. The bottom will have a more complex shape, considering the back of the box, the sides, so this is what I'll be gluing first, when I have full access from top and bottom. And that's why I'm starting by building the foil track plate. It is made of easy-cell PVC foam, 10mm thick. I picked that foam because it's very easy to machine, and it bounds really well when used with a vacuum. And it's now ready to accept the track. I always prepare my tracks with sanding and then roughing up the surface to give as much grab to the epoxy as possible. I usually glue my tracks with just a mix of epoxy and silica, but in this case, I'm adding a layer of carbon fiber that will wrap around the box. This will help to get a very strong bond between the front and the back of the plate. Through this entire build, you'll see that I'm using peel ply almost everywhere. If there's epoxy curing, there is peel ply on it. Once it's removed, it leaves a really good surface with no print through from the fiber. But the main advantage is when you need to stack several layers cured at different times. Usually you would have to sand between each layer, especially if you wait more than a few days. But when you remove the peel ply, it creates a lot of tiny fracture on the surface. And this is ideal for further layer to bound to, kind of like sanding groove, without having the sanding dust. In all my recent builds, I've used those tracks with flanges. As you can see, the top is raised, and what I usually do is laminate over, and then sand until I reach the top again. This is a very easy way to open the box, but it creates a lot of carbon dust. So for this build, I'm trying something different and route the top of the box flat. Once the board is finished with all its lamination, I will use a router to open the box again. But the initial reason for needing the top of the box flat will become obvious later. We'll get back to it. Now that the box are glued, even with a layer of carbon sneaking through, the plate is still quite flexible. As I'm trying to keep the weight down, every layer of carbon I'm adding needs to have the maximum effect. That's why for this portion I will use some ribs. This helps in two ways. First, it increases the distance between the two skins of the sandwich, which make it stiffer, and it adds vertical carbon faces, kind of like an I-beam. As this is a new process for me, and when usually carbon meets epoxy, things tend to get messy, I'll be doing the following in very small steps. First, I'll add a layer of 300 gram biaxial on the bottom surface, and as this is unlikely to shift when I'm putting it on the vacuum, I'll use the same step to add the ribs at the back. This biaxial carbon is really good to make the patch in one go, but it's a little bit more difficult to saturate. So I tend to apply the epoxy on one side, flip it over, and apply more on the other side. I'm adding excess epoxy here to make sure the bond to the plate is as good as it can be. By doing that layup beforehand and curing upside down, I also ensure that no epoxy will get into the box. They are empty and they will stay empty. Next, I can set the ribs in place. They are glued with a mix of epoxy, silica and microballoon. That's my mix to glue everything. I have more silica if I need more strength, more microballoon if I need it easier to sand and light. Finally, the whole package can get on the vacuum. The breather you see here is just meant to spread the vacuum. It will not absorb anything. Finally, I clamp it to the table to ensure that the plate remains flat. When I was making that board, every morning was Christmas morning. A new gift to unpack. The red plastic I'm using is vacuum bagging material. I'm just using it to keep the epoxy away from the vacuum bag itself and reuse it as much as possible. The slides squeeze out all around the ribs so that the gluing went okay. After a quick cleanup, it's now time to laminate the back of the plate. It has a much more complex shape, so to avoid bridging in the corners, I'm using a few different pieces of carbon. A satin weave would conform better around curves, but even the plain weave, once wetted out, can stretch around and fill in the corner. But the peel ply does not deform. It can bend around a single curve, but no compound curve. The fabric will not slip. That's why the bottom shape of the plate can be handled with 4 pieces of carbon and some heavy massaging, but a lot more smaller pieces of peel plies are needed. And I pay special attention to have peel ply on surfaces that will need bonding later down the line, like the top of the box, the sides on the ribs, and around the handle. And then, all back in the bag. I apply the vacuum in 2 or 3 different steps, stopping in the middle, careful to pull the bag to make sure there's no bridging occurring. As the plate is still slightly flexible, I clamp it to the table to make sure it stays dead flat. While that's curing, I can start making template of the 2 panels. Again, by that time, I have no idea what I'm doing, just winging it. But it feels like it's an information I will need later on. And I am not a hoarder, but that thick paper that was used by the movers 6 years ago when I moved here turned out to be quite useful in the end. Sadly, after a few years of making sewing templates, pad templates, a bunch of templates, that was the last piece of it. So to draw the shape of the bottom, I used the plastic, which turned out to be a much better solution. You can just draw through it, you don't need to have access from the other side. The next morning, the plate is cured. Time to unpack and assess that lamination. There is some bridging around the box, but the most important part, the lamination on the ribs looks perfect. Good to proceed. I can now get the plate ready to be integrated into a panel. The triangular shape at the front, on top of giving a place to put the handle, is meant to provide a smooth stiffness transition when you go along the bottom. A square front would be a huge stress riser and would definitely fail. Now that I have the rough dimension of the panel, the shape of the foil plate, I can bring the Nomex in. For some obscure logistic reason, the plate came split into 2 pieces. So that's where years of playing Tetris became handy. The deck will be made out of 3 pieces cut sideways in 1 plate, and the bottom can be done in 1 piece for the front and some offcuts for the back. To determine where to cut the notch for the front of the plate, I use a laser to make sure the tracks work perfectly aligned. Off camera, I run a few quick tests to determine how to connect the honeycomb back together. Superglue is quick, but you need the cut to be very precise to be able to do it. Otherwise, it's not as strong. Bringing the 2 sides together and using epoxy alone also works. But for the capillarity to keep the resin along the whole length of the cell, you need the gap to be very close. So I ended up using my usual mix of epoxy, silica, microballoon. The silica keeps it more viscous, and the microballoon keeps the mix light. And then I just filled all the cells at the boundaries between the different pieces. Those glue lines will impact how the honeycomb bends. For the deck, it doesn't really matter, it's flat anyway. But for the bottom, I try to keep those boundaries outside of the curved section. The back of the board, again, is completely flat, so there it's fine. And that's why I took only 1 piece to make the full front of the bottom. And now, another small workshop tip. Those buttons from earlier, for the hot wire, add them to 2 plates of XPS, and you got the biggest whiteout table, and super light also. But for this build, I had to shorten it a little, so that it can fit in the mattress storage vacuum bag. I'm also very careful to protect that XPS. There's nothing worse on a wet-out table than a small blob of dried epoxy. It makes it way harder to spread anything. Now that all the equipment is ready, I can prepare all the consumables for the first panel lamination. As usual, cut the peel ply, cut the carbon, weight the carbon, This lamination has two pieces, so to make sure everything is aligned, I carefully place everything first before. Plastic that will protect the bag, peel ply, carbon on top, and then check again with the panel that everything fits. For the resin, I mix twice the weight of carbon. This is to account for the peel ply drinking some of it, and to have a lamination on the rich side to adhere well to the honeycomb. I know that epoxy looks weird. I just added white pigment. When saturating bigger areas, for some reason I tend to leave some dry spot. With the white pigment, I know the full surface is saturated, and it also helps to see how rich it is across the surface. You can now see why I needed to flatten those boxes. The carbon here is on the inside of the bottom of the board. And as the table fits inside the bag, the full lamination will be compressed flat, and I know that I will have a perfect bottom surface when I want to laminate the outside. The mattress bag is not compatible with my small hand pump, but that's okay. The vacuum achieved a really surprising vacuum level. That unpacking was as stressful as exciting. That process needed to work on the first time. I have no spare honeycomb. The lamination was a little too rich, and some of the resin draped along the cells and slightly glued it to the table, but that can be sanded off later. Everything else looks good. The carbon shows slight dimples, meaning that the bond with Nomex must be okay. I can now start fitting the bottom to the EPS. That first panel is the easier to fit. I have access from both sides, so I can just put them together, use a laser to carefully align the center of the EPS with the center of the tracks, and draw the shape inside. With only one skin on the panel, it follows the rocker with no problem. Gravity alone keeps it into place, so there's no excessive stress introduced. Finally, I can define the gluing surface by offsetting the line from the inside of the blank. I can now cut the panel to its exact dimension. It's only one layer thick of carbon, so pretty easy to cut with a Stanley knife. I had to go around the board twice, once to cut the top layer, and then a second time with the blade sticking out to cut through the Nomex. For the box, the knife was no match, so I had to use a very old pull saw to cut through the foam. Don't try to use a new blade for that. Carbon will destroy any teeth. A quick sand to make the sides fair and square, and it's ready to go on the board. The laser comes back out to make sure everything is aligned, and I can mark the outside of the panel to define the gluing shelf, groove, feature. I'm cutting it free-handed with my dodgy rotor attachment. I just want to ensure a constant depth. And I set it to cut around 2 mm deeper than the thickness of the panel. This way, I'll be able to fare the board down to the panel, instead of having to fill the sides out. The reinforcement plate ribs need some extra space cut out, and I can finally dry fit the panel, like a glove. To glue it in, I'm using my usual mix: epoxy, microballoon, and silica. This glue line will not see a lot of stress. It's mainly to hold the panel in place. So I'm going heavy on the microballoon to make it as light as possible, adding just enough silica to keep it from flowing out. As the EPS is still quite flexible, I'm using tape to keep the sides pressed against the panel. A quick look inside to ensure there is no crazy squeeze out, spread it all along the edge, and it's ready to be left overnight to cure. So far, the handle is just a hole in the board, so I need to make a box to close the backside. The only real stress that this box will see is when there's a pressure difference between the inside of the board and the outside, which shouldn't be much with a vent plug. So I can go for very light. That's why I'm using the 3mm Nomex left from the core test I did before. It's spending the night in the vacuum, and I'll be able to make a box in the morning. While that's curing, I can add a few patches of carbon on the inside of the board especially at the end of the box, to finish the inside lamination and get a strong link to the stringers. Of course, peel ply everywhere to get a good bonding surface when I need it. And while I'm inside with some glue mixed, I add a second layer of foam on the handle. That will give me 20mm of foam that can be rounded to get a comfortable handle. Now that everything is secure, I can open back the handle. The disc I'm using on the Dremel has a tungsten carbide coating. It lasts forever and makes really clean cuts, but always wear a mask for that. The extra layer of PVC foam can easily be opened with a Stanley knife, and finally I can use a template to get a clean shape on the handle. The inside of the handle can easily be finished with a round of a bit. And for the outside, I will just make a rough surface with a Stanley knife that I will later fill with epoxy. And by now, the raw panel to make the handle is ready. Being only a single layer of carbon on each side with Nomex, it's pretty easy to cut with a Stanley knife. I can then put everything in place, held by two clamps, and use a mix of epoxy, microballoon and silica, as usual with some tint to make it look better, to tack everything together. With the same mix, I can coat the entire surface of the handle to give me a surface to fare. Once the epoxy on the box is cured, I can round over all the edges, correct the slight geometry issue, and make the box ready for lamination. I'll just add a layer of 200g glass, more to ensure that it's waterproof than really for strength. And I use tack spray to hold the fiber in place. The angles of the box are very sharp, and the fiber doesn't really like to conform around those. So the spray helps a lot. You can prepare the fiber, add a slight layer of spray, and really put the fiber tight around it. It makes it much easier to then add the epoxy, a layer of peel ply, of course, and put it on the vacuum. While this is curing, I can turn my attention back to the handle. After a good sand, I still have some low spots, so an extra layer of fairing is needed. PVC foam is waterproof, but the extra coating will make the handle smoother. And of course, I'm adding peel ply because that's where the box will be bonded to. Talking about the box, it's not cured and can come out of the bag. After removing the peel ply and give it a quick sand, I can prepare the handle also for bonding. The box will be bonded with a mix rich in silica to give it a bit more strength. And I just put it in place and tack it all around. The mix is wet enough to accept a layer of 200g glass for added strength, and of course, peel ply. Handle is done. I can now start the process of preparing the board to laminate the bottom. I start by fairing the sides, because the panel was set a little lower. Fill all the gaps in the foam and around the panels that were left. With the same mix, I can also reinforce the sharp edge at the back. It's really easy to damage, so I let the epoxy soak into the foam, making it smooth, and then sand everything off back to a sharp edge. Same for the nose that needed a bit of correction. Ideally, top and bottom lamination both overlap the top and the bottom of the rail. Like this, it gives you rails that are much stronger with a double layer. I chose here to overlap only slightly in the middle for weight reason, and we'll see later how smart of a choice it was. Talking about smart choice, another thing I'm trying on this board is to use the peel ply as a template for the carbon. And as you can see, I'm templating the deck to laminate the bottom of the board. I did measure twice before cutting once. I just measured the wrong thing. Luckily on that board, the deck and the bottom have some kind of strange symmetry, and mistake had no impact. Almost time to mix the epoxy and get on with it. But first, I measure the weight of the peel ply plus carbon, and that's the weight of epoxy I will prepare. Of course, I'll add my white pigment to make it much easier to not leave any dry spot. I split the epoxy in 2 batches. This makes it easier to spray the first one, see where you land, and then adjust on the second. With the carbon soaked, I can now take the board and reverse it onto it. And yes, that polystyrene dust is here on purpose, for reasons. With the carbon roughly in place, I can now flip the wall stack back on a stand and temporarily remove the plastic layer. And now, with the spreader, starting from the center line of the board, I can start removing the bubble towards the edges. And for the ones paying attention, you'll see that the nose and the tail of the board are not covered. I will laminate them later. But by omitting them, I make my life so much easier on that main long lamination. No relief cut to do, and I can focus on obtaining a flat surface. Once I'm happy with the result, I can add the protective plastic back and put everything under vacuum. Side note, the side entry on that mattress bag and the easy closure make it really easy to use. After curing overnight, I still have the same clothes. It's time for the unpack that will completely validate that vacuum bag technique. Plastic came off with no issue, but for the peel ply I'm taking it slow. As much as possible, I'm pulling the peel ply from carbon towards the foam. If you pull the other way, you risk pulling chunks of foam out. And yes, that tape was on the wrong side of the peel ply. Weight check, 1.5 kilo added for the bottom. Assuming another 1.5 kilo for the top, around 400 grams for the stringers, that's a board that will end up around 4 kilos. We're still on track. It's time now to get started on the deck. First, the inside lamination. Same process as usual. Plastic, peel ply, fiber, resin with pigment. The only difference is that I'm adding some thin strips going from rail to rail to try to add some rigidity on the underside. I was a bit concerned that when doing the vacuum on the final outside layer, the deck would bend too much inward. We'll get back to that later, but for now, everything is back on the vacuum. While that's curing, I can now focus on the nose and the tail of the board. It is much easier to do them separately. I can now focus on 2 small patches to make sure they adhere well to the rest. It also allows me to use a different material, carbon Kevlar in this case. It is much more resistant to impact. Like if you stand your board against a wall a bit too quickly, or if you need to ram into someone for some reason. For both, I follow the same process. Apply the epoxy on a flat surface, then apply the patch to the board, make the needed relief cuts, and then pull the patch tight around the shape. Peel ply helps to stabilize it in place, and lets you use tape to make sure everything stays compressed while it's pure. With the board half covered and the deck half laminated, it's now a good place to break. Next episode, I'll work on the stringers, finalize the deck, and put the whole thing together and test it. Thanks for watching.